Welcome to Buckeye Turf Podcast. My name is Carl Danneberger, Professor of Turfgrass Science at The Ohio State University. The topic of this podcast is solar radiation and its conversion into a usable form. This is the first podcast in a series on light and its impact on turfgrass growth. Solar energy from the sun sustains life here on Earth. Plants capture the sun's energy and convert it into a usable chemical form through the process known as photosynthesis. The amount of energy that travels to the Earth from the sun is 1,360 watts per meter squared, and this value is known as the solar constant. As the energy enters the Earth's atmosphere, some of that energy is lost through absorption or it is scattered due to ozone, water vapor, carbon dioxide, or dust. By the time the energy arrives to the turfgrass leaf or plant, the energy level has dropped to 900 watts per meter squared. Of this energy, only 45% is what we would call photosynthetically active radiation. Photosynthetically active radiation falls within the narrow visible light spectrum of 400 to 700 nanometers. The photosynthetically active wavelengths occur in the blue and red spectrum. It is within the blue and red spectrum that the plant pigments important in photosynthesis, chlorophyll A and B, are active. Now returning to the light spectrum, the energy is in the light particles called photons, which contain the discrete packages of energy called quanta. Not all light particles contain the same energy. For example, the blue photon is at a higher energy state than a red photon, although both are equal in physiological potential. In low light conditions, which will be discussed in a later podcast, the relationship between far red to red quanta has a big impact on how turfgrass grows in low light conditions. To express photosynthetically active radiation on a quantum basis, the units we use are micromoles per meter squared per second. To quantify this brightness or intensity of light within the photosynthetic active radiation, we use the term photosynthetic photon flux density. Using the quantum units, the photosynthetic light intensities can reach 1,800 to 2,300 micromoles per meter squared per second at sea level on a cloudless day. For cool season turf grasses, the light saturation point ranges from 534 to 1,072 micromoles per meter squared per second. For warm season turf grasses, this range is much higher, and it ranges from 1,794 to 2,139 micromoles per meter squared per second. Graphically, cool season turf grasses reach maximum photosynthetic capacity at about 1/2 full sunlight, while warm season turf grasses it occurs at a much higher level. Solar radiance for plant growth is given instantaneously, or in our case, per second. It may be useful, however, to express the amount of energy over a day or a month. For example, on a clear December day, the photosynthetic photon flux might be similar to that on a clear day in June, but the photosynthetic photon flux total for the days would be different due to day length. The term daily light integral is used to describe the total quantity of light delivered over an entire day, and is measured in moles per meter squared per day. The greatest difference in daily light integral during the winter occurs between the northern and southern halves of the United States, and the greatest difference in summer occurs between the eastern and western halves of the United States. How can we use this information? Researchers at Clemson University determined that a daily light integral of 32.6 moles per meter squared per day was required to provide acceptable Tiff-Eagle Bermuda grass turf quality. Given that threshold and plotting monthly average daily light integral, we can get an idea when and how many months Tiff-Eagle would receive enough light for acceptable growth and turf quality, which would be represented above this black line. We have described solar energy, but to sustain life it needs to be converted into a usable form. The process is known as photosynthesis. The overall photosynthetic reaction is given here. Radiant energy is converted into usable energy, which is stored in sugars and carbohydrates. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast, contained within photosynthetic cells. These cells are mainly the mesophyll cells contained within the leaf. If we look closer at the chloroplast, it is composed of the thylakoid membrane that contains stacks of grana. This is where light energy is converted into chemical energy, primarily adenosine triphosphate or ATP and nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. There's a mouthful, but it's abbreviated for NADPH. This reaction is known as a light-dependent reaction. Chlorophyll A and B act to harvest the light energy at this point. The ATP and NADPH are then fed into the chloroplast stroma, a substance around the thylakoid membranes where the light-independent reaction takes place. In the stroma, carbon is brought in from carbon dioxide and the chemical energy is stored in sugars. The two reactions, light-dependent and independent, are summarized here. The light-dependent reaction, again, is where the sun's energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH, which is shuttled then to the light-independent reaction, where the energy is stored in sugars and carbohydrates. The core of the light-independent reaction is the C3 or Calvin-Benson cycle, where carbon dioxide enters the process and provides carbon for the creation of sugars and carbohydrates. The energy is stored in the carbon bonds, and when the sugars are broken down in respiration, the energy is released. In C4 plants or warm season turf grasses, an additional step is present, referred here as the C4 pathway. The carbon dioxide attaches and is then cycled deeper into the leaf blade, where it is released and then recaptured into the Calvin-Benson cycle. The C4 pathway is more photosynthetically efficient because carbon dioxide is not wasted, which is the case when cool season turf grasses at high temperatures. However, the C4 pathway requires more energy in the form of higher light intensities. The photosynthetic efficiency of warm season grasses at high light intensities and associated higher temperatures is a reason why they are adapted to tropical and semi-tropical environments compared to cool season turf grasses. The downside for warm season turf grasses is that under shade, the light intensities are not high enough to sustain turf quality when compared to cool season turf grasses. The light compensation point, where photosynthesis equals respiration, is much higher for warm season turf grasses compared to cool season turf grasses. The relative compensation points for cool and warm season turf grasses is graphically shown here. The impact of shade on warm season turf grasses is also shown here in this Bermuda grass rough. The square or rectangle pieces of green Bermuda grass sod were just planted, providing a stark contrast to the longer established Bermuda grass that is growing in the shade. The compensation points may also vary among species. In this case, the shaded portion of this putting green has more annual bluegrass or poa annua than in the full sun areas. Poa annua has a compensation point of 12 to 25% lower than that of creeping bentgrass, which helps explain why it's more competitive in low light conditions or shade than creeping bentgrass. In the following podcast, the impact of shade on turf grasses will be discussed. This concludes this podcast on solar energy and how it is captured by the turfgrass plant.